Sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest stories. You pass them at the grocery store, nod at them on the sidewalk, maybe even live next door, never knowing that decades ago they walked through hell and came out the other side without ever asking for thanks. Captain Samuel Hart was one of those men. To most, he was just an old fisherman on a weathered boat with tired eyes and a tin thermos. But one morning when the world forgot who he was, everything changed. Not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't have to. This is the story of how a silent war hero taught a new generation what real strength looks like, and how dignity, once overlooked, has a way of commanding attention when it matters most. Hands where we can see them now. The shout from the Coast Guard shattered the morning stillness like a gunshot. 3 armed officers stormed aboard the old fishing boat, weapons drawn, every motion tight with suspicion. Their rifles leveled squarely at the chest of the barefoot man standing calmly on the weathered deck. His feet planted, his posture unshaken. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, just stood there in silence as the chaos unfolded around him. They tore through his equipment without hesitation, tossing gear to the floor, their boots grinding sand and salt into a photograph of a woman that fluttered to the deck and was crushed beneath a heel. They flung open compartments, probed every crevice, tension hanging like a thick fog. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked softly, his voice even, almost too quiet to hear. "Search everything," the team leader snapped, not bothering to answer. But the old man didn't so much as blink. He watched them with the stillness of stone, unmoved by their presence or their suspicions. Then the radio squawked, static, then urgency. "Stand down, that's Captain Samuel Hart. Medal of Honor, Navy Cross, step away immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. The agents froze, their weapons slowly lowering as recognition sank in. They weren't on the deck of some nameless smuggler's skiff anymore. They stood before a war hero, and the realization hit hard, sharp, and humbling. No one spoke, but the look in their eyes said everything. They would never forget how wrong they'd been. Captain Samuel Hart wakes with the sun, no alarm clock, no set plan, just the natural rhythm of the tide and the scent of the Gulf drifting through his open window. The cry of gulls and the creak of his dock are his morning chorus. At 81, his body doesn't move the way it once did, but there's still a quiet, deliberate grace to every motion, coiling the rope, organizing tackle, filling an old, dented thermos with thick black coffee that's been brewed the same way since '68. No sugar, no cream, just bitter heat in memory. To the locals along the Florida Panhandle, he's simply Old Man Hart. The quiet one with eyes like storm clouds in a sea-worn crayboat named Annie after his wife. He doesn't chat, doesn't linger, and rarely speaks unless spoken to. When he walks through town, he gives a nod, never a wave, and keeps on moving. Some folks say he's a ghost, a polite one, the kind who disappears into the mist each morning and reappears only when the fish are biting. No one's seen him with a phone. He doesn't own a television, doesn't need the weather report. He reads the sky like scripture, interprets the tides like gospel. You could live next door to him for years and still not know who he is, and he prefers it that way. But there's more behind the silence. Samuel Hart enlisted in the Navy when he was just 17, shaving a year off his age to slip through the cracks. His first deployment was on the swift boats that carved through the rivers of Vietnam, patrolling the Mekong Delta with nerves of steel and an instinct for survival. His first commendation came after he pulled 2 wounded sailors from a capsized craft under a storm of enemy fire. It wouldn't be his last. Decades passed, and Samuel climbed the ranks without fanfare. Always steady, always quiet. During the Gulf War, he led logistics and search and rescue operations deep in hostile territory, his name spoken with respect by those who served with him. Not because he demanded loyalty, but because he inspired it. He was the kind of commander who ate last, who worked longest, who never raised his voice but never had to. His presence alone kept others in line. And then, 8 years ago, his wife Annie died in her sleep. Everything changed after that. They'd had no children, no extended family to speak of. Just each other in a life marked by handwritten letters, quiet mornings, and shared glances. When she was gone, so was something essential inside him. He packed up his dress blues into a trunk. His medals were tucked away in a drawer. The service records went untouched. He withdrew from the world without ceremony, the kind of disappearance only grief can engineer. He didn't vanish. He just turned inward. Fishing became his quiet salvation, not for trophies or sport, but for stillness. Every morning before the light breaks fully over the horizon, he sets out to the same stretch of water. Locals joke that fish come to him out of respect. Maybe they do. To most, he's just an old man nearing the end of a long life, a widower drifting toward the close of his story. But to those who served under him, he's more than flesh and bone. He's legacy. He's memory. He's a legend carved into the fabric of service, the kind of man whose shadow stretches far longer than he ever intended. And though he never sought it, though he spent decades dodging the spotlight, one morning it found him. The day began like all others. The sun hadn't yet risen when Samuel stepped out onto his dock. The boards beneath his boots groaned the same familiar song they always had. He moved without hurry, lifting the tarp from Annie, checking her engine oil, brushing off the bait box, fingers brushing sand like a ritual prayer. Routine kept him grounded. War had taught him the power of ritual, how it could keep a man sane even when the world tried to take everything else. His thermos, battered and burnished by decades of use, was filled with black coffee. It steamed in the chill air, the scent mingling with salt and pine, heat and bitterness. Still one of the few things in life he could control, and he poured a small cup, steady as ever, as the tide whispered against the shore. He poured the measured amount into the lid of his thermos and stood quietly at the edge of the dock, watching as the sky shifted from a soft violet to a burnished copper. Far in the distance, gulls circled and cried above the water, their calls echoing faintly like distant friends calling out through time. For Hart, this, right here in the still hush of morning, was the only kind of peace he had left, the kind that didn't come with regrets or chins. He cast off just as the light caught the waves, turning the water into a sheet of gold. The boat eased out from the dock, the motor low and smooth, humming like a carefully tuned string. Hart always headed to the same spot, about a mile out. The sea there dropped just enough to lure the bigger fish, but still let him glance back and see the coastline if he needed to. That morning, the ocean lay perfectly still, not even the smallest wave, only the lazy rhythm of the tide and every now and then the silver flick of a fish just beneath the glassy surface. He had just set the anchor, just reached for the rod mounted to the shell, and then he saw it. A vessel, it stood on the horizon like a scar, big, gray, unmistakably military. Moving slow but sure, its silhouette cutting clean through the calm sea as it came steadily closer. Hart narrowed his eyes. The Coast Guard didn't usually come out this far, not unless something was wrong. He grabbed his binoculars and trained them on the craft. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter. Activity bustled across the deck. Men in dark uniforms, tactical vests, a mounted light weapon up at the bow. Then the engine noise changed. It picked up, gaining speed. Hart gently set his coffee down beside him. His shoulders straightened, not from fear, but from an instinct that had never left him. A kind of alertness born from experience. He knew posturing when he saw it. This wasn't a standard check-in. Something was happening. A loud voice crackled from the cutter's PA system. Flat, mechanical, authoritative. Fishing vessel. This is the United States Coast Guard. Cut your engine and keep your hands where we can see them. Hart didn't move at first. He glanced down at his hands, weathered, calloused, steady as always. Then back at the cutter, now close enough that its bow waves jostled his smaller boat. He calmly reached for the engine switch and turned it off, then slowly lifted his hands, resting them gently on his head. His face betrayed nothing. His gaze stayed locked, unwavering. 3 officers boarded in quick succession. Boots hit the deck hard and deliberate. One held a rifle, the others moved with practiced precision, fanning out, scanning everything with sharp, methodical eyes. The lead officer approached, young, jaw tight, mirrored sunglasses catching the rising sun. "Name," he barked. Hart answered evenly, "Samuel Hart." No response, not even a nod. "We received intel suggesting this vessel may be involved in transporting restricted items," the officer said flatly. We are authorized to conduct a full search under maritime enforcement statute. Hart didn't object. He didn't flinch. Is there a problem? He asked, voice calm. The officer didn't answer. Search everything, he ordered. And they did. They started at the helm. Compartments were wrenched open, ropes yanked out, tackle boxes flipped. A cup of bait spilled across the deck. His old thermos rolled away, clanging against the gunwale. One officer knocked over a small photograph that had always been wedged above the dashboard. A snapshot of Annie, smiling under the late afternoon sun, taken in Pensacola more than 30 years ago. The frame cracked as it hit the floor. Still, Hart said nothing. One officer muttered under his breath, perfect setup for smuggling. Old man, old boat, who'd ever suspect it? The third officer opened the fish locker. Empty, except for a single red snapper. He slammed it shut and moved on. To them, it was just another search, routine, nothing personal, but to Hart, it wasn't the same. Not because of what they were doing, but because of what it stirred. The tone, the invasion, the quiet presumption of guilt. It all felt too familiar. Not déjà vu, something deeper, a ghost from long ago wearing a new kind of uniform. But he stayed composed, not because of pride, because of discipline. That's what war had taught him. He'd been through real interrogations. He knew what it meant to be under scrutiny that mattered. This was just noise. Still, as they moved through his boat, flipping, searching, discarding parts of his life without a glance, one thought slipped quietly through the stillness of his mind. Something must have gone terribly wrong on their end, because they had no idea who they were dealing with. On the cutter, Petty Officer Michael Consincade gripped his notepad tightly, reading over the dispatch one more time. Coordinates. Timestamp. Vessel ID. The coordinates had led them straight here. Every scrap of intel, the vessel size, the lone operator, the nature of the suspected cargo, had pointed to this exact spot on the water. A 24-foot fishing boat, one man on board. A possible smuggling operation? Maybe weapons. The tip that had sparked the whole thing was anonymous but chillingly precise, enough to trigger an immediate deployment of a Coast Guard response unit. Now, standing on the weathered deck of this quiet little boat, surrounded by silence and sea spray, something about the whole situation refused to line up. Nothing was adding up. No visible weapons, no threat, no aggression, just an old man with eyes like still water and a boat that looked like it hadn't held anything more dangerous than a rusted tackle box in years. Name again? Consincade asked, voice sharp now, edged with growing doubt. The man didn't flinch, didn't blink. Samuel Hart, he said again, calm and firm. Consincade jotted it down in his notebook, eyes scanning the boat as he motioned to one of the agents to keep digging through the console. Sir, he said, turning back to the man, we received a tip. You were identified at these coordinates, suspected of transporting illegal firearms. Is there anything you'd like to say before we escalate this? Hart didn't react. No fear, no defensiveness. Just a stillness that unnerved the entire scene. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but carried a quiet gravity. You're looking in the wrong place. It wasn't resistance. It wasn't even challenge. It was simply a fact. And somehow that was worse. Consincade felt the shift in the air. He'd seen plenty of guilty men, the way they stammered, tried to explain, tried to protest, sometimes too much. Innocent people got flustered too, grasping at any words that might clear their name. But not this man. Samuel Hart stood there like he wasn't even part of what was happening, like they were interrupting a moment he hadn't invited them into. The unease in Consincade's gut hardened. Search wider, he ordered. His team sprang into motion. They dug under seat cushions, pried up hatches, slid their hands behind old wiring. One of them even began unscrewing a bolted-down rod holder. But still there was nothing. Just fraying rope, sun-bleached plastic, and rusted bolts. Not even the suggestion of a hidden compartment. The calmness was too much, too steady, too unshaken. Consincade leaned in again, voice tight. Mr. Hart, if that is your real expertise, I don't think you understand how serious this is. You're not just out here with a fishing license. Our intel placed contraband on this boat. This boat, these coordinates, Solo operator. If you are covering for someone, now's the time to speak up. But Hart said nothing, not a word. He bent down, slow and deliberate, and picked up a cracked photo frame lying on the floor, one that must have fallen in the search. It was a picture of a woman, his wife, probably. He wiped the glass clean with the worn sleeve of his shirt and quietly returned it to its spot on the dash. Like this was just any other day, and not a moment when his life was hanging in the balance. And that stuck with Consincade. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't apathy, it was something else entirely, something deeper. The kind of stillness a man only carries when he's already lived through worse than this. The kind of silence that has weight. "Nothing in the BGE," one of the agents called out from the stern. "Just rope and some old bolts." "Check the engine casing," Consincade snapped. They moved fast, ripping through the last potential hiding places. But it all came up empty. No secret welds, no false bottoms, no hidden stash of weapons. An agent fiddled with the radio, still trying to bounce a signal back to HQ for identity verification. Too many variables, too much ocean. Consincade stepped away, lowered his voice and spoke into his mic. "Confirmed name, Samuel Hart. Solo vessel. Matches last pinged coordinates. Suspected from anonymous firearms tip. Repeat, we need urgent background match. Subject is calm, non-compliant, showing no signs of distress." Back on deck, the team was running out of places to check. One of them muttered half to himself, "Either this guy's the best smuggler I've ever seen, or we seriously blew it." Consincade turned his head and looked at the old man again. Hart was sipping from a thermos, the same one they'd knocked over earlier during the search. Completely unfazed, like none of it touched him. But something gnawed at Consincade now, a slow, churning discomfort in the pit of his stomach. Because this wasn't what guilt looked like. He knew guilt. He'd seen it. This was something else entirely. This was what dignity looked like. He stood near the edge of the boat, his grip tightening on the radio mic more than it needed to. The ocean slapped gently against the hull, a soft and steady rhythm that felt like mockery. Around him, the search had gone cold. They'd torn through every compartment, chased every lead, and come up dry. No weapons, no contraband, no proof. But the man standing across from him still didn't fit. Too calm, too centered, too, wrong. "Headquarters, this is Neptune team," Consincade said into the mic, trying to bury the tension rising in his throat. "Requesting urgent ID confirmation. Subject name Samuel Hart. Solo operator. Coordinates match." The registration checked out, but protocol demanded a deeper dive. They needed the full background. Military history, criminal records, any flagged incidents. A long pause followed. It was quiet out on the water, 10 seconds maybe, but it stretched, heavy and tense, like it might never end. Static broke through again, then the voice of the communications tech. "Copy that, Neptune team. Stand by for records. Pulling now." The boarding team remained still, the air thick with unspoken tension. One officer shifted, adjusting the straps of his vest. Another kept tapping the edge of his seat, a nervous rhythm he didn't seem to notice. The old man, however, returned calmly to the helm. He straightened his coffee thermos, repositioned his weathered tackle box, and picked up a cracked photograph of a woman, his wife, before gently placing it back on the dashboard. He never asked what they were looking for, never demanded an explanation, never once looked worried. That stillness, that quiet dignity, somehow made every armed man on board feel smaller. Then the radio flared again, louder this time. But the voice wasn't the text. It was deeper, sharper, and unmistakably authoritative. A voice trained in command. "Neptune team, this is Commander Addison, Central Command. Step away from that vessel. Immediately." Consincade's brow furrowed. "Say again, sir?" The answer came without a second's delay. "You've boarded Captain Samuel Hart, Medal of Honor recipient, Navy Cross, former commanding officer, Joint Naval Rescue Operations, veteran of both Vietnam and the Gulf War." The line crackled. The boat went silent. Every officer froze. Rifles lowered slightly, eyes darted to one another, the color draining from their faces. Kincaid's hand fell limp from the mic. Sir, we had intel. Addison's voice came back, sharp as steel. Your GPS coordinates were incorrect. Your actual target is 6 miles southeast. That vessel is already secured. You've boarded the wrong boat. And the wrong man. Silence. Not the brittle silence of suspicion, but a deeper one. The silence of shame. The kind that crawls over your skin when you realize you've stepped so far over a line you can't see your way back. Kincaid turned to face Hart. The old man hadn't moved. He sipped from his thermos, eyes on the horizon, same as he probably did every morning. There was no triumph in his face, no smugness, just that same quiet stillness. But underneath it all, there was something even harder to face, a silent, quiet disappointment, one so deep it struck harder than any scolding. Kincaid stepped back, almost involuntarily. Captain Hart, he said, voice halting like the name itself burned. Sir, we didn't know. We thought... Hart didn't reply. He didn't have to. Who he was said everything. One officer looked like he might speak, but the words died somewhere between thought and breath. Another tried again. Please, accept my apology. We didn't mean... Just return my license, Hart said quietly, his tone firm and resolute. The officer hurried to gather the documents they had scattered, smoothing the creases, aligning the edges with trembling hands before offering them back. Hart nodded, took them, and turned back to the helm. Kincaid glanced at his men. Let's go. Put everything back. They disembarked in silence one by one. Not a single one of them looked the old man in the eye. And when the cutter eased away, its engines a dull hum in the early light, Samuel Hart was alone again. Alone on his quiet boat, with his rusted thermos and a sea that no longer seemed the same. Nothing had changed for him, but everything had changed for them. Long before he was just an old man on a forgotten boat, Samuel Hart was the kind of officer who lived in stories passed hand to hand, never told aloud. Stories whispered between the desks of admirals and commanders. Commendations not found in press releases, but in sealed reports. He never chased the spotlight, but his name carried weight in the halls that mattered. It was 1970, deep in the heart of the Vietnam War. River Patrol Section Charlie was pinned down, trapped on a narrow sliver of the Mekong Delta, ambushed from both riverbanks during a night reconnaissance. 11 sailors, barely more than boys, lay scattered along the jungle shore. Their patrol boats splintered and half submerged, the air thick with gunfire and smoke. Hart wasn't assigned to be there. He'd volunteered to escort a supply run. Minutes before the ambush, he had radioed in. And when the call came, panicked under fire, he didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for permission. The moment the call came in that wounded men needed extraction, he pushed the throttle forward and drove his fiberglass patrol craft head-on into chaos. No hesitation, no second guessing. The sea was a storm of splintered wreckage and bullets, but he maneuvered through it like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Like the incoming fire was nothing more than summer rain pelting a windshield. Those who witnessed it would never forget a lieutenant leaping off his boat, his thigh bleeding openly, but dragging one wounded man after another to safety, 11 in all. He hoisted each one over his shoulder and tossed them into his boat, seconds apart, as gunfire chased him at every turn. Even after a bullet tore into his shoulder, he didn't stop. He went back for the last two. Later, a medic asked him why he hadn't waited for backup. They wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes, was all he said. For that, Samuel Hart was awarded the Navy Cross. And then, just a year later, came the Medal of Honor, earned outside Saigon during a mortar attack. He'd shielded 2 of his men with his own body, bones shattered, lungs punctured and filling with blood, still calling out orders, still leading a counterattack. But if you ask him about it now, he'd only shrug. I did my job, he might say. After Vietnam, Hart didn't hang up his uniform. He stayed in, served through the Gulf War. By then, he wasn't the raw-blooded rescuer of his younger days. He was calm, sharp, unshakable under pressure. A tactician whose loyalty never wavered. He didn't chase medals or promotions. Twice he turned down a desk at the Pentagon. He preferred command on the ground, where he could look his men in the eye, stand with them, bleed with them if need be. And when the wars finally ended, when the gunfire went silent, Hart didn't retreat into a quiet, decorated retirement. Instead, he trained the next generation. Navy search and rescue teams learned under him. He was demanding, yes, but fair. He didn't expect perfection. He expected presence. Listen to the wind before you speak, he used to say. The sea always knows more than you do. Cadets spoke of him in hushed voices. The ones who lived through their first real storm said it was Hart's voice they heard through the roar of the waves, not their own. He taught instinct, not just drills. When something feels wrong, it probably is, he'd say. Trust it, or someone dies. But the man who taught others to trust their gut lost his footing the morning Annie died. A stroke, sudden, just before sunrise. She had been making coffee in the kitchen of their small white house in Pensacola. They had shared 43 years, no children, no extended family, just each other, just her laughter echoing through the hallways, her humming while she folded laundry, her hand in his at every Sunday morning on the dock. After her funeral, Hart gave one final lesson. Then he turned in everything. The Ide, the base clearance, the apartment keys the Navy had always provided. No farewell dinner, no framed plaque, no grand speeches. He bought a small, weathered house near the coast and restored the old boat they used to take on weekend trips. He named it Annie. Since then, he's been a ghost, a quiet shadow skimming the edge of the Gulf. Always before dawn, always home before noon. The sea was softer than the world now, and that's all he wanted. That morning, the Coast Guard agents had only caught a glimpse, a man with a fishing rod and a thermos. They didn't see the scar across his shoulder from where shrapnel had sliced through muscle and bone. They didn't see the small silver coin he kept in his pocket, a token from one of the 11 men he saved, engraved with, "Alive because of Hart." To them, he was just another old man on the water. But to those who knew, he was something else entirely. And he didn't have to prove it to anyone anymore. The next morning, just after sunrise, the dock creaked under the weight of familiar boots. Samuel Hart moved as he always had, measured, unhurried, one step ahead of the wind. His thermos of black coffee sat in its usual place on Annie's dashboard. The lines were coiled, the tackle checked, the engine hummed like a soft, steady breath. Another quiet morning in the life of a man who only wanted peace. But this morning, he wasn't alone. A car eased to a stop behind the house. Not a government vehicle. No Navy emblem, just a plain civilian sedan, dust clinging to its tires. A young man stepped out, shoulders stiff with uncertainty. Petty Officer Michael Connecade, the same man who, not long ago, had boarded Hart's boat with suspicion burning in his eyes and a loaded weapon in his hands. Hand resting near his holster just yesterday, now he stood at the edge of the dock, cap clutched in both hands, looking noticeably smaller than the sharp lines of his uniform would suggest. Captain Samuel Hart saw him but didn't acknowledge him, not at first. He just kept working, fingers steady and deliberate as he checked the line on his spare rod. "Sir, may I have a word?" Captain Michael Concencade's voice was gentler than it had been the day before. Hart didn't answer right away. He tied the line, clipped the hook, then finally turned, his sun-worn face lit softly by the morning light. "I was wondering if I might join you today," Concencade added, not pushing, just asking. "If that's all right." Hart gave a small gesture toward the extra rod beside him. "You know how to tie a blood knot?" Concencade allowed a small, embarrassed smile. "Not well." "Then you'll learn. No apologies, no ceremony. Just two men pushing off together, boat churning slowly toward the same familiar stretch of sea. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was working, building something. The only sounds were the engine's low hum and the hush of water against the hull. It wasn't until they'd anchored that Concencade spoke again. "My grandfather served in Korea," he said, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Third Infantry. Used to tell me stories about frozen rivers and rice paddies, about foxholes so cold your hands would just stop working." He paused, chuckling softly at the memory. He was stubborn, cigarette always tucked behind his ear, even in church. Hart gave a slow, knowing nod. "He used to tell me, boy, always respect the quiet one in the crowd. Chances are they've seen something the rest of us haven't." Concencade smiled faintly at his own words. "Didn't really understand what that meant until yesterday." Hart cast his line into the water, smooth and practiced. Sounds like he knew what mattered, he said. Constantine sat silently for a moment, watching the water shift and shimmer. Then he said, I still don't get it, though. Yesterday, we came at you hard, rifles raised, accusations flying, treated you like a criminal, and you didn't so much as raise your voice. You just stood there. He turned to Hart, confusion still evident in his voice. How do you stay that calm? Hart reeled in a little, adjusting the tension on his line before answering, his voice low and even. Because I've seen what real chaos looks like. Constantine turned to study him, but Hart offered no more. He didn't have to. The deep lines etched into his face, the heavy crease near his eye, the unmoving strength in his posture, all of it spoke volumes. In war, Hart continued after a moment, you learn to listen to silence. It's the moments before the shell hits that teach you the most. Panic wastes time. Anger clouds judgment. Calm, that's what saves lives. Constantine gave a slow nod, swallowing something between understanding and remorse. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he said. Not just for what we did, but for not knowing who you were. Who you are. Hart let a small smile pass across his face. Thin, but genuine. I'm just a man trying to fish, he said. They fell into a quiet that didn't need to be filled. It had weight and meaning, like something earned. And when a fish finally tugged at Constantine's line, Hart leaned over and said gently, don't yank it. Let it come to him. So he did. And somewhere between casting and catching, Michael Constantine began to understand, really understand, the difference between command and control, between power that shouts and strength that doesn't need to. The next morning came wrapped in a soft, early mist that made the world feel quieter, almost sacred. Down at the dock, Captain Samuel Hart stood where he always did, boots rooted to the weathered planks, his old boat Annie rocking lightly with the tide. The air carried the scent of salt, worn rope, and long memory. Footsteps approached behind him. Morning, sir, came a voice. It was Michael Constantine again, though this time he wasn't in uniform. Just jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, a cup of gas station coffee in one hand, a small tackle box in the other. If that second rod's still open, I was hoping we might try again. No radios, no rank, just a man asking. Hart looked up from his knots and paused for a long moment. Then he nodded quietly toward the boat. Bring your own bait. Pick some up on the way here, still not sure what works best for snapper. Hart allowed the faintest smile. That's all right, the fish don't care what you bring. They care how long you're willing to wait. And so they pushed off again, this time not in tension or suspicion, but in a quiet that felt like understanding. The boat drifted out once more, engine humming low, carrying both men toward the same stretch of sea. The flat surface of the ocean rippled softly behind them as the boat glided toward their usual spot. They dropped anchor without a word. All around, the sea stretched endlessly, still glass-like, barely disturbed by the boat's presence. Overhead, a few gulls circled lazily, drifting on the breeze like they had all the time in the world. There was no need for words, no need to rush. Just the open water, the quiet, and the groaning creak of the old vessel settling into the tide. Constantine fumbled with his fishing line, his hands uncertain. Hart moved beside him, showing him how to adjust the weight, how to feel the tug in the rod, and what signs to look for in the water. Patience, Hart said, his voice as steady as the sea around them. Fishing's not about chasing, it's about waiting, listening. Most people today, they forgot how to be still. That's why they miss what matters. Constantine stared at his hands, calloused and worn. You always come out here alone? Since Annie passed? Hart gave a faint nod. It's quieter this way. He paused, then added, more to himself than anyone else. But lately, quiet feels different. They drifted in a silence only shared by men who no longer needed to prove anything to each other. Eventually, the conversation returned, not with force but with ease, like the tide itself. They talked about war, about peace, what had changed, and what hadn't and maybe never would. But Constantine wasn't asking about battles or badges. He asked about the in-between, about decisions, about walking away from everything you knew and somehow still feeling whole. Hart's answers came slow, deliberate. Few words, but each one carried weight. There's a kind of power in being unknown, he said, in just being the man out here on the water. Time passed, an hour, maybe two. No fish, no complaints. Neither man seemed to mind. Then Cade broke the quiet again. You ever think about going back, telling people who you really are? Hart didn't hesitate. He shook his head. I did what I had to do. The rest, that's not mine to chase anymore. These days, I just want a clean deck and a quiet conscience. He looked out across the horizon, then turned his gaze back to Cade. You know, he said, his voice softer now, sometimes the people you overlook, they're the ones you end up owing the most. The words hit Cade hard. He swallowed, the truth sitting heavy in his chest like a stone. Yesterday's tone, his orders, the assumptions he'd made, it all came rushing back. Yeah, he murmured. I believe that now. The sun had risen higher, the light sharpening but still gentle. A shift in the wind stirred the boat. Hart reeled in and checked the bait. Let's try one more cast, he said, almost as if suggesting they try again at something deeper than fishing. Fish or no fish. Any day's a good one when you get a second chance. And so they did. Two men in a boat, not drifting toward fish, but towards something rarer, understanding. The morning continued its quiet climb, the sun warm but not harsh, the water shimmering under its light. They fished in near silence. Cast. Reel, cast again. No rush, no pressure. Just the rhythm of the waves and the occasional cry of a gull overhead. Then finally a tug. Cade's rod bent, just slightly. His eyes widened. That familiar jolt of excitement surged up, an old reflex telling him to pull hard. Easy, Hart said, without even looking up. Let it fight first. And so Cade did. He loosened his grip, allowed a bit of slack, then reeled in slowly, gently. A silver flash broke the surface. A snapper, small, maybe 10 inches, twisting in the morning light like a ribbon of quicksilver. He lifted it with both hands, holding it up like a modest trophy. Hart leaned in, studying the fish with the kind of attention born of experience. Not ready, he said plainly. Cade blinked. It's legal size, right? Maybe, Hart said, but not by much. Let it grow. He met Cade's eyes. That fish ain't ready yet, same as most of us. Cade looked down at the fish, really looked. His hands tightened around it, then slowly relaxed. He moved to the side of the boat, knelt, and released the snapper. It lingered for a moment, suspended in the stillness, then darted away with a flick of its tail, vanishing back into the depths. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Cade eased back onto the bench, eyes fixed on the edge of the world. The boat rocked gently beneath him. Hart's words echoed in his mind, not just about the fish, but everything. The silence, the restraint, the strength it took to let go, to forgive, to not need to be seen or praised. He saw it now. This wasn't just a fishing trip. It was something far older than tactics, deeper than training. It was something you couldn't learn in a manual or a debriefing. It had to be lived, witnessed. He turned his head to watch Hart, who was calmly coiling his line. Like he had done 1,000 times before, he sat there, quiet, steady, at peace. Nothing rushed him. Nothing needed to be said. Just the rhythm of the waves and the hush of the sea. Thanks for letting me come, Kincaid said softly, his voice low, almost reverent. Hart didn't turn to look at him. He simply gave a small nod. Most folks don't stay long enough to listen. And that was it. No more words, no need for them. The boat drifted further into the stillness, slipping deeper into the soft hush of the open water, leaving behind the fish, the memory, and something far more lasting. A quiet lesson, whispered by the sea. Not every hero walks around wearing their story like a badge. Some carry it quietly, the weight of it tucked deep inside their bones. Like Captain Samuel Hart, whose strength showed not in loud speeches or grand gestures, but in the calm way he spoke when others raised their voices, in how he offered forgiveness without needing an apology, and how he chose understanding over ego. In a world where noise so often masks meaning, it's easy to miss people like him. We overlook them because they don't demand attention. But maybe that's exactly why we need to pause, to slow down long enough to notice the ones standing quietly in the background. Because it's often those very people, the ones who speak little and demand nothing, who carried us through the worst of the storms. Hart's story isn't just about a misunderstood day on a fishing boat. It's a story of grace, unspoken, unwavering, of humility, of quiet dignity, the kind that comes from someone who has already given more than most ever will. We all know someone like that, don't we? A grandfather who never spoke a word about what he seen or did during the war. A neighbor who waves every morning, even though no one ever stops to talk. A stranger who offers kindness when no one expects it, then walks away without needing thanks. So maybe it's time we ask ourselves, have we ever misjudged someone? Thought they were ordinary, only to find they'd lived through more than we could imagine, or sacrificed more than we could ever repay? Or maybe, like Kincaid, we've met someone like Hart, whose silence spoke more powerfully than any words ever could. If this story has touched something inside you, don't keep it to yourself, share it. Think of someone who still believes that respect is something earned, not demanded, and let them know this story found you. Because sometimes the greatest lives ever lived aren't making headlines. They're sitting quietly beside us, weathered by time, shaped by sacrifice, and anchored by something deeper than pride.